Hello, 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 and welcome back to another episode of Opinion or Opportunity. I am your host, Don Gringo. I know it's been a little bit, but thank you for coming back. Have a very, very special show today. So, with everything that's happened recently in the news, there's been one question that's been floating around more than ever. And it's the question, should and could Texas secede? Well, I have Daniel Miller. Okay, he's the founder of the Texas Nationalist Movement. And that's what they want. They want their own Texas nation state. So, can Texas actually stand on its own if it actually left? Let's find out. Here we go. So, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your movement.
Sure. My name is Daniel Miller, and I'm president of the Texas Nationalist Movement. And we were founded back in 2005. And our mission is the political, cultural, and economic independence of Texas. So, we as an organization, it's been fun to watch the establishment political guys and the mainstream media try to marginalize us, but they try to get everyone to ignore the fact that outside of the two major political parties here in Texas, we're one of, if not the largest advocacy organization.
I was actually doing a little research, like I had said before we started recording. I found it quite interesting that, for instance, when people look at countries and can countries like survive on their own,
Right.
if you actually cut out Texas by its current GDP numbers, it would rival number 9 in the world, which would be Italy, as a
Yeah.
standalone country, which was absolutely astounding to see. But some of the research I've done is some pundits will throw back at this, and I'm going to ask you the same question: is
Sure.
can Texas afford not to get the federal dollars? I mean, some research says we pay more because obviously, you can see I have a Texas flag behind me. I'm a transplant going on 3 years.
Right.
But some research says we paid the United States more than we receive, and some people say we couldn't do without those federal dollars.
Yeah, it's interesting watching the opposition do their Common Core math. To try to say that we pay, we get more out of the federal government than we pay in. But what they typically do is they take to skew the numbers. They'll take a program, say like Social Security, right? And Social Security is what's termed as an earned benefit. So you pay money into a system with a promise that you will receive money back. And so they do that to skew the numbers, right? A good example of why you got to take sort of Social Security out of the equation, and frankly, any federal pension benefits is how they treat Social Security recipients that live overseas, right? You don't have to live in the United States to receive federal pension benefits. It's right there on the State Department's website. So, they do that to try to skew the numbers. But the fact of the matter is that any policy institute worth their salt has run the numbers. And on average, what you're going to find is that Texas overpays somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere from 103 to 160 billion dollars a year into the federal system. Now, that number, people may say, well, you can't survive off of 103 to 160 billion. Well, that's not all that we pay into the federal government. That's just the amount that we overpay, right? That we never see again, not in a federal job here in Texas, a federal grant, a federal benefit payment. It just goes away to be either eaten up by this monstrous bureaucracy, or to be redistributed to other states to kind of prop up their failures. So, the fact of the matter is that from an economic standpoint, if you were to take the federal government out of the equation, while Texas on average is about ninth or 10th in the world for GDP, there's no doubt in my mind that in the absence of the federal government and all the, that sort of giant sucking sound that's moving toward Washington, D.C., there's
Yeah.
there's no doubt in my mind that we're probably looking at somewhere becoming the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. And that's because Texas gets it right economically.
Well, but doesn't Texas, because they get it right economically, but they have a law in the books. Correct me if I'm wrong here though. because again, being a transplant, learning about Texas, and then obviously having all this, but Texas has a law in the books that most states don't have, which is every 2 years the budget needs to be balanced, right?
Yeah, yeah. Texas it has a, we are required constitutionally to balance our budget. And interestingly enough, people don't, there are a lot of quirks about the way Texas governs itself that people don't realize. Like our legislature meets for 140 days every other year. And outside of a special session called by the governor, that's it. I mean, it really cuts down to the government that governs best governs least. Now, granted, they do get a lot of things passed in that 140 days, and it's pretty frenzy. But this idea of balancing the budget is not new to Texas. I mean, they're required to do it. Literally, the legislature is only required to pass one piece of legislation every 2 years, and that is the budget, and it must be balanced.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I found quite interesting because there's a lot of states, like you pointed out, that actually fail that without other states like Texas paying into the system for them to be propped up. I mean, if their budgets had to be balanced, I mean, they wouldn't be in the state they're in today. And of course, places like California wouldn't be in debt. I mean, as it is today. I mean, so Texas, in some aspects, financially and economically, does get it right. But let's talk about the next step when you look at separating Texas, in my mind, from the rest of the country. So I think the one thing that's against the Texas Nationalist Movement is really the idea of America as, hey, we're part of the United States, and we have a lot of people in Texas, including myself, who's a transplant, right? I mean,
Right.
I'm originally from Massachusetts. I was living in Florida for over a decade before I came here. So when you talk about separation, how does that look for like from not an immigration standpoint from Mexico into Texas into the United States, but you have families here that are from other states. How does that look from an immigration standpoint when people want to come to Texas, if it's its own country now, separate from the United States? I mean, you're
Sure.
looking at having a whole new border. Are we talking like maybe when me and you were growing up, like with the Canadian border, all you needed is a driver's license? Are we talking like you're full fledged? No, Texas has a lot of border at that point. Full fledged, border patrol surrounding all of Texas. I mean, that's a hell of a border.
Sure. Yeah, and look, the thing, it's always interesting to me, that the federal, the people that are so insistent that we stay part of this federal system don't themselves understand federal policy, right? Like a good example, there's like 1.5 million legal border crossings between the United States and Mexico, almost I think it's a monthly basis, using nothing more than what's called a border transit card, right? You
Right.
don't have to apply for a visa. You don't have to have a passport. It's literally a card. And that's happening right now. That's current policy. You see this accomplished around the world where you can freely travel between countries that are friendly with one another, that have compatible systems. You can, either travel is completely unrestricted or, has something just akin to that border transit card that you just have to have on you and present when you go through. So, this concept that somehow Texas leaving the Union means that we've erected the Great Wall of Texas around the borders, or somehow we floated off into the middle of the ocean. It's sort of ludicrous in the context of current federal policy and the way that the world works right now.
Well, I wanted to touch one more thing on economics that just popped into my mind, and I wanted to
Sure.
ask you, but I jumped ship, so excuse me. No, it's listen. I have a
Yeah.
lot of questions. This
I
when I
I'm
started
there.
doing this, researching this. I mean, again, not on board saying okay, this is going to 100%
Yeah.
work, but the idea of if it could was like
Right.
was like wow. It's like it really throws a punch in your gut because doing the research. If I get the information from you properly and people get it properly from you,
Mhm.
um, it's a true possibility. It's like a true possibility that Texas could stand on its own legs and to hell with everybody else. And so let's get back to that because the
Sure.
one thing I looked at, obviously way back in the past, and we're talking way back in Texas history, it was its own country for a while, for like the decade, right? And it had its own currency. So would Texas, in your mind, would have to go back to its own currency, and what would it be backed by if it did?
Well, Two questions. Does Texas have to? And the answer is no. Texas would, I'm sure Texas would want to. You know, most self-governing independent nations want to have their own currency, but we don't have to. As a matter of fact, in the period of transition, you know, from the time that Texas says, okay, look, we're going to leave, we're going to be a self-governing independent nation, but we've got some things that we've got to do to get there, right? You know, there's transitional issues, constitutional, statutory. There's a lot of those things. So in that transitional period, what effectively happens is we continue to use the U.S. dollar, either through a formal currency union or an informal currency union, right? These things, again, exist all around the world. You can go to other countries and they will have either adopted the US dollar as an unofficial currency, or in some cases adopted it as an official currency. And those are unilateral actions, right? Those don't require the federal government's permission. Okay, but that's just transitional. You know, ultimately, Texas is going to want its own currency. Now, what shape, form, or fashion that's going to take, who knows? Who knows what it's going to take? We could honestly be in an informal currency union indefinitely until we work out exactly how we want to do it.
Well, the only reason why I asked that is because, you know, when the United States went off of the gold standard, it kind of threw the currency out the window and made it subject to interpretation of what it's worth. I mean,
Right.
I mean,
It's a
every year
fiat
it's different.
currency. Right. It's
No,
fiat currency. But, you know, here's the thing. As of right now, we have zero say over monetary policy. I mean, none. I mean, we as Texans and as Texas, we have virtually no say whatsoever. That's been jobbed out to the Federal Reserve. They regulate the speed of the printing presses and therefore regulate essentially the value of the dollar against goods and services and other currencies around the world. So, you know, the fact that we just would have the ability to affect that decision and determine how we want to handle our currency is pretty important. And I think it's important for folks out there to understand that, you know, Texas has already started taking steps that direction, kind of under the radar. You know, one of the pieces of legislation that our organization was proud to support and in my mind helped push across the finish line was the Texas Gold Depository Act. Which essentially gave us our own state-owned gold depository right here in Texas.
our own
And
Fort Knox, basically.
our essentially our own Fort Knox. Yeah, I
Well,
mean,
I know it's not exact, no apples to apples, but saying
no, but
layman's term for people who don't understand.
sure, yeah, and what it is, it's a depository for both state-owned precious metal resources and privately owned. But one of the things that people did not people completely missed about that piece of legislation was that there was a provision in there that called for the creation of an electronic metals based currency around the gold in the depository. People, you know, it essentially set up an electronic transaction system based on the deposits of gold. And people, that I don't know why that part of it did not gain more attention, but it was, in my mind, the first steps toward Texas setting up at least some form of its own currency that was attached to the value of the precious metals in hand.
No, a lot of people know also tend to look at this, and I'm not saying it's a problem, but it might be a problem, right? If Texas actually did want to separate at some point, you know, we moving into this, this state, if it went its own country, there's a lot of companies in the past decade or more who have upended, left other states to come to Texas,
Sure.
expecting still to be part of the United States, but came to a state that was more business friendly in nature, right? So what happens to those companies that upended, moved to Texas? I mean, how would you try to keep them? Because essentially they were still predicting to be part of the United States, and as soon as you pull that plug, they're not.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it's not something that happens overnight, and I
No,
think
I'm not saying overnight, but I
yeah,
mean, obviously,
yeah,
like for instance, Elon Musk just moves here, and then next you know, 5 years from now, Texas is independent, and he did not expect to be part of an independent Texas. He expected to be part of the United States, but in Texas. I mean,
Look, I'm sure he'd be perfectly happy to plant a Texas flag on Mars for us, you know. Uh, but look, you know, to your point, I mean, you know, there's rhetoric and there's reality, okay, and a good example of the sort of rhetoric that you get from the opposition we saw during the Brexit debate, right? There was this Project Fear pumping up, you know, saying these companies were going to all flee the UK and relocate to, you know, some European country. And what happened, it didn't materialize, right? It was rhetoric and fear mongering. And what those people realized is maintaining their headquarters and their center of operations in the UK outside of the EU was still monetarily beneficial, right? I mean, they received a financial benefit from that, you know. And look, let's be honest, it's about business, right? It's a
right.
cost benefit analysis. And here's what we know: we know that in the end, it may take a while to get there during the transition side of this and negotiation, but I suspect that Texas and the United States will have a free trade agreement, right? I think it would be hypocritical for them to want to negotiate a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico and not with Texas, especially with all those refineries and you know, of course, the ports that we have, the Port of Laredo and Houston. So we're going to get a free trade agreement out of it. But
You
we
know, that
will.
was one of the questions you segued in that I wanted to get into. A lot of people
Sure.
outside of Texas who don't live here and obviously see the amount of business actually done within the boundaries of Texas. And I do, I travel all over Texas. A lot of people will sit there and say, well, you know, once Texas has no more oil, they can't stand on their own, right? I mean, but think about it. I mean,
Yeah.
outside of Texas, and I will be the first one to say, in some aspects, I was ignorant to the fact of how big Texas was until you really live in Texas, travel Texas, and you go, well, goddamn, you could still travel 9 hours from east to west, and you're still in Texas. I mean, you're not
Sure.
anywhere near the border, and then you look at all the different farming businesses and outside of it. Texas is renowned for its oil. So let's kind of get that out of the way. If Texas had no oil, could Texas, in your mind, still stand on its own?
Well, absolutely. I mean, how many countries don't have oil that can still stand on their own, right? I mean, having a lot of oil is not a prerequisite to being self-governing. You know, otherwise there are a lot of countries out there that would be screwed. But look, let me just put it to you this way: back in the 1980s, right, at the height of J.R. Ewing and Dallas and all of that, you know, Texas was really about the oil. Now there was some diversification, you know, but it was energy and ag. I mean, those were the two core parts of the Texas economy. And then, of course, in the 80s, the oil bust happened, right? And fortunes were lost. I mean, the state lost tons and tons of revenue. And so the governor at the time and you know, the political powers that be said, look, we can't keep going through this boom bust cycle. We have to consciously diversify our economy and make sure that it is not so strictly tied to the boom bust cycle of oil. And so that's exactly what they did. You know, Texas over the years has, you know, people forget that Silicon Prairie was a thing before the Silicon Valley was, and you know that's revived. You know, we've got probably got more tech here than Silicon Valley does right now. Of course, they get all the press and the cool shows on TV,
Right.
but you know, we're manufacturing chips, and you know, we have technology, and our technology sector is booming. But look, people also forget that Texas, across all 50 states, is the number one exporter of manufactured goods, right? So our
No, absolutely. I was
manufacturing
doing the
is
research, and that is absolutely 100% no statement. I mean, that was one of the things I wanted to get into later. Was logistically, Texas logistically is amazing. Like, I mean, you're in the middle of the country. Everything may or may not pass through Texas at some point, going east or west of the United States,
sure.
and you have your own ports. You have this. You have that. I mean, it's like your own cattle, your own farming. I mean, what doesn't logistically Texas have? It's like,
Yeah, if we don't have what it takes to be a self-governing independent nation, then who does? You know, I mean, that's ultimately the question. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that level of productivity, prosperity, whatever. I'm not saying that is an absolute prerequisite to being a self-governing independent nation. But it does beg the question: if 195 other countries around the world can manage this, then what is it about us that says that we can't?
Yeah, but I gotta throw it out there, and it's not again, it's more of a probing and challenging type situation here because of the fact
Sure.
I want to make the statement. It obviously helps because in the Texas Constitution, don't you as a movement need to change the minds of at least 2/3 of the population in order for that to even happen to leave?
Where did the 2/3 come
I think
from?
I think I heard that like, doing some research. Like you need so much of the population vote in order to make
No,
Texas, you
all
know.
no.
Okay,
Texas has always been a majority rules state. I
right.
mean, you can amend the Constitution with 50% plus one. So that's the only threshold that we need. There is no supermajority of voters.
Okay.
That's the way it's always been. It's the way it will always be. There are exceptions to the 2/3 rule when it applies to the legislature, right? When they are, proposing a constitutional amendment or something along those lines. But there has never been a supermajority rule for a vote of the people. Never.
Now let's get into one thing. I know this has been posed to you many times, but let's get it out of the way. I know we probably should have done it up front, but when it comes to the United States Constitution,
Sure.
this is really not touched upon anywhere in that document when it comes to adopting or succeeding states. Right?
Yeah,
It's really
it's
not.
the federal constitution is absolutely silent on the issue, and it's important to note that because there are a lot of people out there who says, well, the constitution, doesn't say that you can do it. Well, that's not the purpose of the federal constitution, right? The federal constitution lays out what the federal government can do. It then lays out what states cannot do. So it's explicit about what they cannot do. And then it goes on to say that anything not specifically delegated to the federal government or prohibited to the states are reserved to the states and the people. Okay, so that's plain language of the Constitution. And because of that, that means that the Constitution's silence on the issue reserves that question to the states to make up their mind. And Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution tells us exactly how that happens. And it tells us, well, not exactly, but it at least gives us in principle how that happens and reserves the right to the people of Texas to reform, alter, or abolish our form of government in such manner as we may think expedient.
So let's get into one thing that was kind of fascinating when me and my wife moved here. My wife is actually from Monterrey, Mexico. I met her while in Florida. So she understands Texas a lot better than I do because she's been coming and going out of the state for a long time legally.
Right.
So anyone out there legally, and when I moved here, I was quite fascinated because my mother had visited Texas on and off throughout my whole life, and she always loved Texas and she always talked about Texas, but I was quite surprised that I know a lot of states think they have it, but the Texas pride thing here is absolutely amazing. Like you can't walk into a store anywhere without seeing something Texas. I mean, the attitude here is quite different, and I know it was always, I guess, joked upon in other states. Like there's the United States and then there's Texas, or vice versa. I mean, it's just very weird to actually live here and see it now, but it's quite amazing. I now can look back and go, yeah, a lot of the states I lived in, a lot of the states I traveled to, they don't have that like hoorah, whatever state like Texas does. Texas really does enjoy its culture.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, what other state can you go buy a waffle iron in the shape of your state? What, you know,
I see that all the time. I see that
you
all
know,
the time.
it's
Me and my
true.
wife look at each other and go, man, this is so cool. I mean, I've never lived anywhere that was so proud
Yeah.
of who and what they were.
Well, I mean, look, it's bravado. I mean, yeah. I mean, maybe a bit. I think it was George W. who said that. Some people say that in Texas we have a swagger. We just call that walking. I mean, it's sort of that kind of thing. But it really feeds into it. I mean, if you go around the world, people can pick out Texas on a map. You
Right.
know, you if you tell people that you're a Texan, you get a vastly different welcome than if you say you're an American tourist. I mean, it's a very different situation. And it's look, it's that same way among the other states, and I think a lot of the other states may kind of look at us with a bit of green-eyed jealousy. You know, we just to give you sort of a flip side, you know, each side of the coin. I would say people in other states will tell you, say, hey, you can always tell a Texan, you just can't tell them much. You know, they kind of look at us that way. And we, you know, and our side of it, we say, don't ask a person if they're a Texan. If they are, they'll tell you. And if they're not, there's no need to embarrass them, you know? So
Right.
it's flip sides of the coin, but yeah, I mean, but I would venture this. I mean, look, Texas has got pride in spades. I mean, we've got it oozes out of us. I mean, if you go in there and look at the Christmas tree in the other room, it's got Texas ornaments all over it. And that's not a byproduct of my work in the Texas Nationalist Movement. That's a byproduct of me being born here. You know,
Right.
it's just the way that it works.
So since
But
you're born there and you're a native, let me ask you this. So
sure,
you obviously see a lot of transplants the past decade coming here. Texas has
sure,
offered over the last decade probably, if not the most, one of the most states that offer the most opportunity out there for anybody, right? So you have a lot of
right.
transplants. So how long does a transplant need to live in Texas before he can call himself a Texan? How about that one?
Man, I don't have an answer for that. I will tell you that there are people that have not even made it here yet that consider themselves Texan. You know, because you have Texans by birth, you have Texans by virtue of their address. You definitely have those people that are Texans in spirit. You know, a lot of people forget about in Texas history when Texas began to open up, you know, back in the 1830s. People that that needed a second chance in the other states or even overseas, they would skip out. They would paint GTT on their door, gone to Texas, you know, and they would load up every possession they had, and sometimes it wasn't much or anything, and they would make that arduous trek into Texas, which was a wilderness at the time. You know, it was not a hospitable place, but it was bountiful in resources and wide open in opportunity. And you know, Texas has always been that place. I think where even in the modern era where opportunity abounds, we get it right because we say, look, you know, Texas is yours. Everything it has to offer, everything that it has been, everything that it can be is yours. And what you make of it is on you, but at least you're getting the chance.
So is that the message that needs to be told to people who are moving in from other states? I mean, your movement's been around for a while, but obviously you've seen the demographic change because of the influx of transplants. Like myself, I came for work. It was just better out here than it was where I was at.
Sure.
I've embraced the Texas culture. My wife is from Mexico. She's always embraced the Texas culture, so it's easy for me. But I also look at it differently too, because being a Marine, I look at Texas like the Marine Corps of the United States. I mean, it sets itself apart. Like, yes,
Right.
we're part of something, but we don't listen to you. And I was funny because I read probably like a year or two ago. I think it was the New York Times or something. I may be wrong, so no one quote me. But there was an article that was, does the United States need a rogue Marine Corps anymore? Because what most people don't understand about the Marine Corps is the motto is God, Corps, and then country. And it's like Texas is kind of like the same way: God, Texas, and then the country. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So for me, picking up the Texas attitude, I can do that. That's not a problem. But how do you message it properly, market it properly to people who come here from other states, still expecting to be part of the United States? Because they have family maybe here and somewhere else. That we're going to do this, and we want you part of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, and this is anecdotal, right? But
Sure.
as you can imagine, we get a lot of contact from people that have just moved here or in the process of moving here. I mean, we probably get asked uh, about available housing and jobs probably more than the Visitors Bureau or the Texas Workforce Commission, or we probably should start a relocation service. But so we hear it, and look, I think a lot of people are moving here, right? There are a lot of folks that are moving here, and they are already separating in their minds, right? I mean, there is a sense that coming to Texas is that separation, that separation from, the state where they were, but a lot of the other things that really we're talking about related to the United States and the federal government and things of that nature. I think there's almost a mental or spiritual separation for many of those people when they move here. So, I think you see that played out to a certain extent in the politics. There's a fear that people have that all these folks that are moving here are going to be the ones that are blocking Texas. And I would almost posit that those are going to be a lot of the people that help us push this thing across the goal line.
Oh, well, no, don't get me wrong. I mean, even
Yeah.
someone like me, I mean, I'm not sold on the idea, but I can tell you this, that if you
Well,
were
we
to
still have
approach me
time.
on the street and say, "Hey, Christopher, what do you think of what you have today going on versus
Yeah.
what you've experienced?" I will tell you that my almost 3 years in Texas has been a better, lifestyle than where I've been. And I was living 5, 10 minutes from the beach, outside of Clearwater Beach. I mean, Florida.
Yeah.
So I'm telling you that I can tell the difference here. I mean, let's face it, you don't have income tax here, so people
Nope.
keep more of their money. Housing is more affordable. That's why most people, I think, outside of work come to Texas, is because you can have better opportunity. You don't have an income tax, so you keep more money. And by the way, you can get more house, no more bang a buck for the house that you buy. I mean, that's even true from where I came in Pinellas County, Florida. I mean, it was, a 2 bedroom, 1 bath could run you on a lot for, depending where it was, $250,000. I mean, for a two bed, 1 bath, it's like, holy shit, no, no. I mean,
Right.
come on.
Right.
I'm not saying I'm in the most expensive part of Texas, because I'm not. I'm actually in Central Texas because I travel all over Texas. So
Yep.
I'm closer to Fort Hood. And I can tell you that for the same 250,000, you get a hell of a lot more house here than Texas than you would ever where I was in Florida. I mean,
Right.
so
Yeah.
yeah,
People
I
are
can
finding
see.
that out.
Yeah. So let's talk about one serious question that has to be brought up. So
Sure.
obviously, the United States ain't going to take that lightly if it even comes close to the possibility that Texas succeeds. What's to stop the U.S. government from, deploying, say, Fort Hood, the army here in Fort Hood, to become an occupational force and, keep Texas part of the United States?
Yeah. It's interesting. This is one of my favorite questions because
But it's true. It's possible.
well, look, anything's possible. We could vote for Texas and get hit by an asteroid. Anything is possible, right?
Right.
I mean, but some things are more probable than others. The, so let's just sort of take it 30,000 foot view, and then we'll drill down. Okay,
Sure.
uh, you have to ask yourself, for this military incursion to happen, what would those circumstances need to be, right? So let's kind of go through your scenario. Texans go to the polls, Texans vote, they say we want to leave, we start the process, we send negotiators, and the commander in chief of the United States military says, okay, great, let's go start bombing Walmarts in Houston. Okay.
I wasn't saying
You know,
going bombing, but I'm sure they could have deployed, say, called martial law throughout the state of Texas, deployed the military, and
okay.
you know,
So let's take that. For what reason? What have we done? What have we done to warrant military occupation?
well,
Did we
technically,
did we take
no,
up arms? Did we
tech,
take up arms? Did we shoot anyone? Did we take anything over? All we did was we cast a vote that they didn't like. Okay.
but Texas is a cash cow for the United States.
I do not disagree with that.
I
And
mean,
so,
if you want to boil it down to power and
sure,
money, money is going to win out over this one, because
absolutely,
they're going to
money
want
will
to
win
keep
out.
Texas no matter what way you want to cut it. They're not going to let it go lightly.
Well, they won't let it go lightly. But let's get something straight. A military occupation over voting the way that they don't like doesn't set well with the people of Texas, because remember, for this to be a thing, over half of the people of Texas have to vote to leave,
Hmm.
right? So are half of the people of Texas going to suffer a military occupation? So what does that leave? What does that leave on the federal government side? Brute force? Are they going to bomb our refineries? Is that what's going to happen?
Well,
Are they going to enact a trade embargo?
it
Because
could.
that's cutting off their nose to spite their face.
Well, it could be as simple as what Michigan just did with the electoral college people, where they blocked the courthouse from even having the vote. I mean, the state house from even having the electoral college, cast their vote. At least a good half of them, right? The Republican side. So
So if
they could literally just block the state house.
So, interestingly enough, if the federal government prevents us from voting or from governing ourselves, they have effectively overturned their own constitution and our constitution, thereby justifying the action that we have to take to tax it, right? I mean, because let's be honest, if at the moment that they suspend their own constitution and use military force against us in any shape, form, or fashion, the union is over anyway. Texas may be the first, but we won't be the last. But I want to put it in this context for you. Okay, I want you to think about this. You were in the Marines, and so you will understand this probably more so than many people. For the last 70 plus years, even more now, the United States federal government has sent our grandfathers and fathers and our sons and daughters around the world to fight and sometimes die for the right of self-determination for people everywhere, people in countries that most of our people don't even realize exist, to fight for that right of self-determination. So imagine what sort of hypocritical nonsense it would be and what sort of global backlash would exist if the United States federal government decided to use the military on Texas because we voted wrong,
Well,
right?
you kind of segued into the next couple of aspects to where I wanted this to lead down, which is great. I mean, this conversation with you're segueing better than I can segue at this point,
Well,
right? So,
before we segue though, I want to finish the one point on this because
sure,
I think this is extremely important.
sure.
When Scotland had their vote to leave the UK. In the run up, no one ever suggested that the UK was going to bomb Scotland or use the military to hold them. It's the same thing with the European Union and the UK. Time and time and time again, this sort of, well, they won't let you leave has been used on the opposition side. Those people opposed to the idea of self-determination and self-government, and it just frankly has never materialized. At the end of World War II, there were 54 recognized countries around the world, and at the end of the 20th century, there were 192. And in very few instances, mostly low-profile instances, did something like that occur, where those people were held by force, right? So if Quebec can go to the polls twice and have an independence referendum without threat of military force, and Scotland can, and the UK can, and country after country after country can do so, then what's wrong with Texas or any other state of the union for that matter having that vote and being able to do so without the threat of military force? And at the end of the day, final point is this. Poll after poll after poll that's been taken with active duty military has shown that right at half or maybe a little bit less of the military believe that a state absolutely has a right to leave the union. So if a president or joint chiefs or whoever decides to want to punish a state for having a vote like this, issues that order, you're immediately looking at half of the military having to make a determination as to whether or not they're going to obey or disobey an unconstitutional order.
No, and I absolutely will go with that. The other thing too, doesn't Texas have its own little militia or military anyway?
Yeah, Texas has the Texas Military Department, and the Texas Military Department is basically a three-branch military. It's comprised of the Texas Army National Guard, the Air National Guard, and the Texas State Guard. I'm sorry. And it serves as what is effectively a backbone, I think, for us to develop our own national defense off of. Our own full-fledged military. The difference
Most people
with the
don't realize that, do they? That Texas has that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love doing is sending over the link to the Texas Military Department, and people saying, "What is this? You know, what is this like?" Yes, we have our own military, and look, it's not fully militarized, right? I mean, we have our own, we have our own planes and jet fighters, and I mean, we build F-16s here in Texas, so it's no big deal there. But for us, when people talk about this this issue of national defense moving forward, I think it's important for everyone to understand that we already have what is effectively the skeletal framework for a full-blown national defense, and definitely something to build off of.
Yeah, again, that was one of the things that I was quite surprised when I was doing my research, and I think probably more people who are interested in the topic, if you're watching and listening, you need to do a little bit more research on the topic because it is quite fascinating to understand what Texas does and does not have, and it has a lot more does than does nots. I mean, it was quite fascinating. But now you segued into something too, which was one of the reasons why I thought that the United States wouldn't let Texas leave, even if by occupation, is because once Texas leaves, that really opens the door for a lot of these other states to follow suit. I mean,
Well, other states, look, absolutely.
no,
When I
I'm not
wrote,
saying other states haven't. I'm saying is if you're successful, if
sure,
your movement's successful here in Texas, that is literally the stepping stone, foundation, cornerstone of the foundation of other states coming to Texas saying, "Okay, you did it. How did you do it? We want to join you in this situation." And the United States wouldn't be able to afford that, right? I mean,
well, look, I think, and I said this when I released my book 2 years ago, Texas, why and how Texas will leave the union.
we gotta plug the book too. So
Well, that I just did.
yeah, we're gonna make sure it's in the description. We'll make sure you.
Okay.
We're gonna
No,
make sure it's there for you, my friend. I mean,
no worries. Look, I'm not trying to plug the book. I'm just trying to refer back because one of the interesting things that happened for me was a lot of the attention for the book came from outside of Texas. But that's actually, I mean, it wasn't really surprising because that was really my intent. Although the book was written obviously from a Texas perspective about what's happening here in Texas. Uh, as I went around promoting the book, I was telling these people in other states, look, although this is about us, it's about more than just us here in Texas. Ultimately, I believe that every state should be having this very same conversation, right? Because it's a very pragmatic conversation, right? We're not talking about anything that's out there just kind of odd. We need to be asking some hard questions about the relationship that we have within the federal government, within this federal system. Is it best serving our people?
but
Now,
what
for us,
sparked it? I mean, you're talking now. Every state should have this, and you started your
sure,
organization. Let's say we're not going to say officially 2005. Obviously, prior to that, because you got to build up to found the idea and everything else. But
sure.
what was the underlining issue that made you say, "Okay, enough"?
Me personally,
I guess in
uh,
general, yeah, you personally, and then in general, what makes you think that the movement's okay? Listen, X, we're done. We need to start looking at this. We're done. What was that one thing that set you off that said, "Hey, listen, I'm done with this"?
well, look, for me, you got to understand, I was involved in this fight long before 2005, right? August 24th, 1996, to be exact. And that came after a lot of frustration related to the idea of this constitutional republic and the union, and looking at essentially how irredeemable and unreformable it is, right? Um, but let's admit that the federal government is beyond reform. If you look at the past 50 years, look at every attempt at fundamental reform to put the federal government back in its box and put the federal system back into its constitutional confines. It doesn't happen, right? Instead, what we've seen is a federal debt that is now getting bouncing close to $30 trillion. We've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of federal laws, rules, and regulations. So many now that if you were to print them up and stack them, it would be taller than the San Jacinto Monument, which, by the way, is taller than the Washington Monument. Just going to throw that out there. You've seen the number of unelected bureaucrats swell from 500,000 to 2.5 million. And you've seen our currency devalue to the point that from the time that I got involved in this, it's lost a third of its value. The dollar has, if not more. So, for me in 1996, those things were still happening, right? I could still look back and see that these attempts at reform were not happening. And so when the idea, the concept of Texas independence presented itself, it's like, wait a minute. If it's the federal government that is the greatest threat to our constitutional rights, to to our freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and all of those rights that we know, if they are the greatest threat to liberty, and they are the greatest oppressor, in the sense that they take our money, we get less than those sorts of things. If they are the problem, then Texas independence solves that problem, and it removes a layer of government that we don't need, and allows us to focus on what's important to us here in Texas, and adjust to the priorities, adjust our priorities according to our challenges that we have here. So
let me ask you a straight out
1996,
question.
man, I was in.
So let me ask you a straight out question then.
Sure.
Do you honestly believe the idea of America has changed? I mean, when I say that, the principles that was founded on, do you really think that they're not being adhered to? Do you really not? The America of what should have been is not the America we got today.
Well, I think that goes without saying. I think if you were to poll people, I think I would be in the solid majority on that one, right? But your question was, did the principles change? And the thing is, the principles didn't change. What happened was the structural challenges within the Constitution. There were some structural problems that allowed this sort of thing to happen, and it was a conscious decision, start going all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and those people who wanted to transform the Union from a union of states into a national government. Since then, that progression has happened. Well, the problem with that is that the Constitution structurally is not adequate for a national government, right? They're not compatible. So you wind up with things like something you actually mentioned a moment ago. You talked about how you were surprised at how many things Texas had, is what, like the Texas Military Department.
Right.
Well, if you look at all 50 states structurally are republics with their own constitution, their own 3-branch government. They are not administrative or political subdivisions of the federal government. Okay. So what happens is that you have all of these pieces and parts structurally that say, okay, look, the Constitution is effectively a limited political union, a free trade agreement, a free travel agreement, a mutual defense pact, and a little bit of a smattering of a multinational postal convention thrown in. I mean, that's effectively what it is. When you look at the 14 or 17 enumerated powers that are in the United States Constitution, then that's what you've got. And so structurally, the Union is that way. But we're being told and being pushed that somehow that this is a monolithic nation state, and that all 50 states are just political subdivisions. We're, people that we're told that the states are to the federal government like the cities are to the states. And that's just simply not true.
I think the problem, though, comes into, again, I'm going to bring it back to money. Sure. I think a lot of states have become welfare states of the American government. And, there's very few states like Texas that pour in a lot more than what they get back.
But about a dozen on average a year get more. But also, I want you to look at this, because it's not simply about the kind of the plus and the minus. Okay. Because one thing that we did not talk about is what happens with that money when it comes back here.
Sure. Let's get into it real quick.
Yeah. So, obviously some of that money that does come back goes into federal payroll. And so the question then becomes, is that the best use of that money? Because we know the federal government's 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats is unwieldy, right? So, the question is that the most efficient use of that money? And typically it's not. Okay. But more than that, when that money goes back into these programs that are administered by the state government, there's typically a matching fund situation, right? Where Texas has to spin up an agency, they have to staff it, and then partial funding comes from the federal government, and the state government has to make up the difference. See, that's why in the last legislative session, over 40% of the bills filed referenced a federal law, a federal agency, a federal program, some federal regulation, a federal court case, right? 40%. So that means that not only are we overpaying, but half of our laws are being written in Washington, D.C. effectively, so that we can try to grab at some of that revenue and get it back, while in the process still having to spend more money to be able to claw that money back. So, we're actually having to pay for a lot of those dollars twice. So, what you do is you effectively just take it, say, okay, look, what is our overall tax burden, right? If Texas were to just say, okay, look, all the money that we're being taxed right now goes into a pot, and every bit of money, and that's at the state level or the federal level. Let's just say that all of it did. We didn't increase anyone's tax burden. What does that look like? And what you find is that it's more than enough to not only fund a self-governing independent nation state, but to do so according to our priorities. That's why we say, when people say, well, if you guys leave, they'll just cut off Social Security. It's like, well, they won't, because Social Security Administration pays federal pension payments for people who live outside of the United States. But you know what? If they did, we wouldn't even bat an eye. It
No,
wouldn't be a
you're
problem.
telling me you have the money for it, so it doesn't matter.
Exactly. And that's the thing about it. It's not so much just that plus and minus of the overpayment. It's all of the strings that are attached to every dollar that comes back and every regulation. We didn't even talk about the fact that, there was a study that was done out of George Mason University about federal regulatory accumulation, where the federal government continues to heap regulation on top of regulation on top of regulation. So that, they had a pretty famous study that I talk about in my book. But what was interesting is there was another study on that very similar issue, where they took some of the numbers, the same numbers that George Mason University did, and this is what they found. They said that because of federal regulatory accumulation, there's about a 2% compression of GDP annually. Okay. And you take that since, say, 1949, when the federal superstate started to really ramp up.
Yep.
And here's what you get. When the study was dropped, the average median household income was $53,000 a year. And their study found that in the absence of those federal regulations, the average median household income would have been $330,000. So not only are they robbing and stealing our tax money, but because they can't even govern correctly, what they've done is they've made, on average, every household $277,000 poorer.
Okay, well, that's a staggering number. So let me ask you a question. No, for people who are watching and listening, and obviously I'll put it in the description, what's the best way for them to get this information from your organization?
Yeah, they can go right to our website, to tnm.me, tnm.me/Texit. And we put all of this information there. Pretty much every question that you asked me today is answered there.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I said an hour. I'm going to try to stick to the hour, but I have a lot more, and I'm hoping to get you on record one more time, two more
Yeah,
times, because I don't see
let's
this
do it.
going away anytime soon. I mean, you're not going away. You've been there since 2005. Let's be honest. So,
Right.
how close has your organization come? Let's be honest and have that conversation. How close have you come to actually getting this to happen, this to fruition?
Well, it has been it has been a work. I mean, it's been a lot of work. 2005, this issue was polling. Support for this issue was polling in single digits, and we just started. We were just founded.
You
And
just went green.
did I?
You got a filter on?
No,
Oh, there you are.
that's bizarre. Okay. But I went green, so it was like I was feeling under the weather, right?
I was thinking, saying you were going to think about money or something. You know what I mean?
No.
Or you went to Grinch. It's Christmas time. You went Grinch on us.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That's weird. Okay. So back where we were talking about before I went
Polling.
green.
The polling. Single
Polling.
digits.
Single digits. Thank you. Sorry, the green threw me. We were polling single digits, but we got out there and worked it, as a political and social movement. And so we started engaging the Texas legislature in 2009. That's when we thought that we had connected with enough Texans to really kind of make a push to have this conversation about the legislation that needs to be passed. And we were okay. We were at, I think polling was, the Research 2000 poll had Republicans right at 48%, independents about 40%, and Democrats at 15%. But it was on a soft question, right? About if Texas, would Texas be better off as an independent nation? But it's not a far stretch to go from there to would it be better off to should it be? And so we saw those numbers climb in 2014 when it was polled right around the time of the Scottish independence referendum. Boy, they were not happy with the results that they got here because it showed 54% Republican, half of independent, and 35% of Democrats were in favor, not just believing that Texas would be better off, but that Texas should become an independent nation. So, that's when we knew that we were pretty doggone close. Legislatively, of course, all of this, and I don't know that we've talked about this yet, but all of this has to culminate in legislation, right? The legislature is the bottleneck for this. And so, for us, it's been, our legislative work beyond some of the other aspects of our mission that I mentioned earlier, like the Texas Gold Depository Act, have been really focused on getting us that Brexit-style vote right here in Texas. And so 3 times we came close. State Representative Leo Berman, now deceased, phenomenal guy. And I do believe he was a former Marine, but he had agreed to file the legislation. And when he made the agreement to file the legislation, the Speaker of the House at the time, Joe Strauss, threatened to tank all the rest of his bills. And he had some bills that were pretty important to his constituents. And he just, I'm not going to say he was intimidated, but he did the cost benefit analysis and said, look, I just can't file it. Okay. So then you move on to the second closest that we came, and that was after a meeting with then Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst and 4 state senators. Dewhurst's office began to actively work on trying to get this legislation filed for us. He said, look, I want to try to make this happen, but I want to make sure that we've got the AG on board with us so that we can clear any legal hurdles if there's any problems. And the Attorney General at the time was Greg Abbott, now governor. And Abbott took a hard pass on it because he was afraid of how it would affect his chances of getting elected as governor. He was ramping up for his governor's run. And so Dewhurst said, I can't move on this without the AG. And Abbott is, he's doing his thing. So second time. Third time, State Representative James White from HD19 over here, he filed or started the filing process for the legislation. The Ledge Council, because of how it was constructed, stripped out the referendum and converted it to nothing more than a resolution, and it died in committee. Okay. So, where we are right now is we have the best crafted piece of legislation moving through the process, sitting with the Texas Legislative Council, submitted by State Representative Kyle Biederman. And this piece of legislation looks, by all measures, it looks like it's going to fly through Ledge Council and get filed day one of the legislative session. So we're excited. This is a major thing. I mean, people have to understand no piece of legislation has been filed like this in probably 150 years. So this is history in the making.
Yeah. So what is this? No, no more humorous note. Does this end with a President Ted Cruz finally?
You
I had to
know,
put it
that's
out there. I mean, come on. I had to put it out there, right? So
uh,
does Ted Cruz finally get his wish? He's president. You know what I mean?
I don't know. I mean, I think he's been flirting on Twitter with actually kind of rebooting the whole Zodiac killer thing. So, uh, I don't know what his intentions are right now. But look, what it ultimately the people of Texas will choose who governs them. That's the way that it's always been, and that's the way that it's always going to be. And so, post Texit, the people of Texas will make their decision on who will be their chief executive and who's going to represent them in a newly formed, hopefully they call it a Republican Texas Congress, but that's ultimately up to the people
Do
of
you
Texas
think
to
you'd
decide.
take back the old Republic of Texas name?
I think so. I suspect that that's the direction that people will want to go. It makes the most sense.
No, I'm just saying. I
Yeah.
understand that when for that decade it was its own country. That's what it was called, Republic of Texas. That's what I'm asking. You think we're going to hold to tradition and keep that name and go back to say, okay, this is what it is? I mean, it's what
Yeah. I
it's
mean,
really always been anyway. Texas has always been treated differently, attitude wise, regardless. I mean,
right.
but here's the kicker, though. This is the one thing most people don't realize either. Is doing this research.
Mhm.
If Texas really wanted to screw over the United States government anyway, you guys have a very funny law in your constitution that allows you to break up into 5 different states.
Yeah, that's actually not in the Constitution. It's a funny, quirky bit of Texas history, and really shows you how unique the relationship is between Texas and the rest of the United States. But here's what it boils down to. The people say that Texas was annexed by treaty, and that's not entirely true. A treaty was presented, but it was voted down by the United States Senate. And so what happened was that Texas was, Texas was admitted. I have to choose my words very carefully. Okay. Texas was admitted by a joint resolution of annexation. So a joint resolution of Congress. Okay. Now, if you look at the joint resolution of Congress, there were actually, remember, we're dealing with 2 Congresses here. We're dealing with the Republic of Texas Congress, and we're dealing with the United States Congress. So, Republic of Texas Congress issues out this joint resolution that has these 3 provisions, and the third provision is that Texas would be able to divide into 4 additional states, and those 4 states would be guaranteed admission into the union. Okay, now think about that phrase. Okay, it's very specific.
Right.
4 additional states, and those 4 states would be guaranteed admission into the union. Okay, so that was part of the joint resolution. So if you think about it, just the acceptance of that part of the agreement presupposes that there would have been a situation where Texas could have divided into additional states, and those states would not have been admitted to the union.
So honestly, you could get away with cutting out 100 acres, saying this is Texas, and we're taking the rest of Texas, and it's its own state.
And we're not, well, yeah, and we're not,
Here,
and
United
we're
States,
not
you get
applying
one
for
acre of
admission.
land. Good job. This is
Well,
Texas.
look, you're more generous than me. I suggested something about 1 inch square. Okay, here's the state of Texas. What we'll do is we'll just cut a 1 inch square notch out of Dalhart up there somewhere, and it's okay. That's the state of Texas, and we've divided into an additional state. And we understand that we are guaranteed admission, but we're not applying. So thank
I didn't
you.
know it
Best of
like
luck.
that. I didn't read it
Yeah.
like that, but I'm glad you told me because I didn't read it like that. That was because I thought it would just be like Texas saying, you know what, United States, I'm just going to screw you over anyway. Here, let me send 5 different states of Republicans, to the capital, and yeah, good luck. I mean, we're going to get
Best
what
of
we
luck.
want anyway.
Yeah, and look, I mean, that's
Well,
still
actually,
at the end
Austin
of
would
the
be Democrat. Let's face it. That's no.
well, I mean, they could get gerrymandered too. But here's the thing. The thing to bear in mind is that and people propose this. It's political, so that no one wants to split Texas up. They don't want to. But
Well, why
and they
would you?
propose it like,
It's a huge state with a bunch of resources. I mean,
well, yeah, and I mean, think about all the waffle irons we'd have to throw out, right?
oh,
I mean,
I
what's
gotta be honest, man. I love that attitude. I've been here, and I gotta swear. I mean, that's the one thing. I don't know if it's the Marine in me or what not have you, but that attitude of Texas and Texas pride. It
Yeah,
just gets me, and my wife too. It's like, oh my God. I mean, you just everywhere. It's everywhere.
it is everywhere.
And I love it. It's like you just don't see the public, the actual citizens of other states adopting that attitude and being prideful about where they are
Yeah.
in other states like you do here. It's just incredible.
It's and I mean not to beat a dead horse, but it's frankly just because we're awesome. I mean, I don't know any other way to put it.
Well, I want to do this. Let's end with this,
Sure.
right? Let's end with here. I'm sure I'm definitely going to try to get you back on. I'm sure there's going to be more questions because I'm going to do more research.
Sure.
And you do have that referendum trying to come up, right? I mean, that's coming up when?
Yeah, the legislative session starts next month.
Yep.
I think January the 12th is the date, and we're fighting hard. I mean, we've got Texans coming, that have been on the fence about this or that have been silent. They are organizing, and we're glad to have them on board. Obviously, for months now, our numbers have been growing, but more than just the numbers growing, we're organizing people. They are in the ears of their legislators right now, saying that they want a vote on Texas independence. And look, let me just throw this out there, because I think for this interview right now at this time, this is the important thing people need to understand. Where someone stands on the Texas issue, whether they're for it or against it, is not what's up for debate right now. What's up for debate right now is whether the people of Texas, at a minimum, should have the right to vote on this issue. This is what is in question, right? If we have the vote, then ahead of that vote, we can have the debate over the pros and cons of Texas. I'm pretty sure you understand where I stand and where the organization stands on this. But we need to have a lot of voices. There needs to be a very healthy and vigorous debate about all aspects of Texas. But
But
that
again,
is not the debate.
what you're proposing is not the debate. What you're proposing is, do you have the right to debate? That's what the question you're asking.
Yeah, the legislation that is being presented to the legislature is not a declaration of independence. We're not saying in this legislation that if this legislation passes, we're out of here. What we're saying is, if this legislation passes, then the question will be placed in the hands of the people best suited for making that decision, and the only ones allowed to make that decision constitutionally, and that is the people of Texas. So that's what's in debate here, as to whether or not fundamentally we have a right to answer this question in a poll, and not one taken with a survey size of 1,000 people by some third party pollster, but literally the people of Texas, after a vigorous, thorough debate on the issue, going to the polls and casting a vote on whether or not the state of Texas should reassert its status as an independent nation. Let the people answer the question. Let the people speak. If Texas is such a horrible thing, then let's have a vote on it and let's have that debate ahead of time. And then if Texas is such a horrible idea, it will lose in a landslide. It will get buried. It will be thrown in the rubbish heap of history, and I will go down as the biggest buffoon that politics has ever seen. But at a minimum, the people of Texas should be able to vote on the issue and express their political will.
Well, again, I mean, it's not. I don't think it would be a buffoon. I think if anyone honestly takes a look at it, it's a hell of an interesting question. I know, and it's like anybody I've ever had on my channel. Like I've have flat earthers who are on my channel and they believe in flat Earth, and I say, hey, listen, it's a very interesting concept, and if you provide me with interesting facts that support you, then we're going to talk about it because. I think the problem here is when you're talking about something of this magnitude versus that magnitude. Yes, it's great to want to believe in that theory, but either side's got to prove something. Here, it's definitely more fact based, and what most people don't understand is what Texas actually has, what Texas can actually do. It's funny because you hear in politics a lot of time Russia, 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 but Russia on the GDP level is actually beneath Texas. I mean, that's staggering. That's absolutely staggering to think that Texas, as its own separate nation, beats out Russia.
And look, you have to understand that figure, that GDP figure, is still within the constraints of the federal system, right? So
Absolutely.
let's go back to the economic argument that we had a while ago, not the economic discussion we had a while ago.
Yeah, I don't argue on this channel. I want to get
Yeah, yeah.
information out.
No. But we go back to the economic aspects of this, right? And you realize, all right, if that money, take that, just that overpayment, right? We won't even get into all the other factors, but take the overpayment, the 103 to 160 billion dollar a year overpayment. You take that and you pump that into the Texas economy, just that portion of it. What does that do overall for our GDP? Now we're suddenly looking at moving from, say, the ninth largest economy in the world to perhaps the eighth or the seventh, because we don't know specifically where that money will go, but we know that there's at a minimum a one-to-one parity with discretionary income, right? So that money stays back here, that money stays in our pockets, wherever it goes, but it goes right here into the Texas economy. Now factor in all the other aspects, right? So all of a sudden now, if property taxes can go away because there's more money circulating through the economy, so our consumption tax no longer requires us to have a property tax. The raw revenue coming off of that, now that's somewhere in the neighborhood of about another 50 to 60 billion dollars a year in property taxes that are having to be collected, that are now staying in the pockets of Texans,
Right.
that are being spent in the economy. So now what are we looking at? We're, seventh or sixth largest economy in the world, and that's just some aspects of it, right? As we start really drilling down on these numbers and realizing, as an independent nation, right? I'm not talking about hypotheticals, right? As we start living out a post-Texan economy, I think we're all going to be blown away by what sort of economic engine it is. And I think the world will probably be surprised at how much of an economic, how much Texas was driving any success that the U.S. economy has had, at least over the last 20 years.
No, I'm not going to disagree with that. Like I said, that was my one fear, is if you did get it to the point where it's an actual consideration and it's going to be an actual possibility. I don't think the United States would ever let Texas go because of the fact it's a cash cow, period, the end. But, one last question, no major details. Relationship with Mexico, better than it is today?
I think it definitely
Post Texit. No.
Yeah, look, Mexico is a major trading partner for Texas. As a matter of fact, I think they're the number one recipient of our exported goods, if I remember right. But Texas has a super economic relationship with Mexico, and we've got a cultural tie there too, right? So if you're looking at a post-Texit relationship with Mexico, it's obviously going to be better. Simply because we'll have the ability to essentially set the parameters of that relationship. Whereas right now, the relationship that Texas has with Mexico is directly tied to the political football that is Mexico on the federal side of things, right? Where we have politicians in states that really don't have anything to do with Mexico. They don't border Mexico. They're not impacted by it whatsoever.
Not just that, but Texas has what, 40, the biggest Latino or population of like 40%, right? I mean, some type of heritage.
Well, it's a little north of 30 some odd percent. Depend on what the definition is, right?
Right.
Okay, but look, the fact of the matter is that Mexico is a phenomenal trade partner for Texas. Mexico has been a good neighbor for Texas to a certain extent. I mean, there's obviously in the modern day, we've got some issues that we've got to hash out with those guys. The Rio Grande Water Treaty and some of those things. But the immigration issue, the violence that spills over from the border. I mean, we've got some issues that we need to address. But let's be honest, Texas hasn't been able to address those issues because the federal government says that's our power, that's our authority to negotiate that, not Texas. And so, and look, I mean, let's look at how the federal government has treated veterans and how they deliver your mail. and understand that that's how they're addressing the border issues and the immigration issues. They're doing it just as efficiently as those two systems. And if anyone has any doubt about what I mean poorly. They're
No, I get it. All right, so we're a little over, so let's end it here. I want to thank you so much for having you on. Just stick around for a couple minutes, but we're definitely going to get you on again after the referendum. I want to see what happens. We need to talk about this more because living in Texas, it obviously affects me, and I think a lot of people today are kind of interested, especially after what happened recently with the Supreme Court and everything else going on. I'm sure you've been thrown front and center again, all over again, right? So
sometimes
let's talk.
feels like drinking out of a fire hose.
That's it. So let's talk about that the next time. Stick around for me, will you?
Will do.